They came from beyond the stars and straight into our theaters.
Gee whiz.
They're here already! You're next! You're next! This type of defense is useless against that kind of power.
This isn't every sci-fi story from the atomic age. This is the era of alien invasion. The golden decade when Hollywood imagined Earth under siege and taught us to fear the skies. Join us as we revisit the classic films that brought the invasion home. One saucer, one scream, one shadow at a time. The year 1951 marked a turning point for science fiction on the big screen. In the span of just a few months, 3 very different films introduced American audiences to the idea of visitors from beyond the stars. The very first was not a lavish studio production, but a small, independent picture. Released in March, The Man from Planet X was shot in only 6 days on foggy, recycled sets, giving it a haunting, dreamlike quality. The story takes place on the lonely moors of Scotland, where a reporter, a professor, and his daughter encounter a strange spacecraft from a dying world. At first, the visitor seems frail and almost helpless, but under pressure from a corrupt scientist, the alien reveals a darker mission. The film's cast was made up of dependable working actors rather than big stars, but each brought a certain flavor that made the story work. Robert Clark plays John Lawrence, the journalist who serves as both narrator and reluctant hero. Clark became a familiar face in low-budget science fiction throughout the 1950s, later starring in cult favorites like The Astounding She-Monster and The Hideous Sun Demon. Margaret Field appears as Enid, the professor's daughter who rediscovers her childhood friend in Lawrence and becomes caught up in the mystery of Planet X. Off-screen, she may be best remembered today as the mother of actress Sally Field, who would go on to become one of Hollywood's most acclaimed stars. Raymond Bond takes the role of Professor Elliot, the well-meaning scientist whose discovery sets the story in motion, while William Schallert steals scenes as Dr. Mears, the ambitious and unscrupulous assistant who schemes to use the alien for his own gain. Schallert went on to an extraordinarily long career in film and television, appearing in everything from The Patty Duke Show to Star Trek and In the Heat of the Night. Behind the camera, The Man from Planet X was the definition of shoestring filmmaking. Director Edgar G. Ulmer, a veteran of low-budget pictures, managed to shoot the entire movie in just 6 days. To stretch his meager budget, he borrowed sets left over from the 1948 epic Joan of Arc, covering them in fog to disguise their reuse. Producer Jack Pollexfen later revealed that the film was budgeted at $38,000, but ultimately came in at $41,000. Still a fraction of what the major studios were spending on science fiction that same year. Even the alien itself carried an air of mystery. None of the actors recalled ever being told who was inside the bulbous-headed costume. Margaret Field remembered him complaining about the suit. Robert Clark thought he had once been part of an acrobatic troupe, and William Schallert described him as a small man, not much of an actor. For decades, his identity was uncertain, though rumors pointed to Russian Jewish immigrant Pat Golden. IMDb now credits Golden as the Man from Planet X, standing about 5 feet tall and 49 years old at the time. Despite its humble origins, the film left an impression on later filmmakers. Steven Spielberg has acknowledged that his idea of using music to communicate with aliens in Close Encounters of the Third Kind was inspired, in part, by The Man from Planet X. Proof that even a quick, low-budget production could cast a very long shadow. In the frozen Arctic, where civilization ends and nightmares begin, a team of scientists and soldiers makes a chilling discovery. Something ancient has been waiting beneath the ice, and now it's awake and hungry. The Thing from Another World gave 1951 audiences the ultimate terror scenario, an unstoppable alien predator against a group of isolated humans with nowhere to run. Long before Alien and John Carpenter's remake, this Arctic shocker became the template for sci-fi horror that filmmakers still follow today. Released in April of 1951, the film was inspired by John W. Campbell's novella, Who Goes There?, a tale of an alien life form that could perfectly imitate anyone it absorbed. That meant the real terror wasn't a monster you could see, but the creeping suspicion that your closest ally might already be the enemy. The filmmakers set that idea aside, partly because the special effects of the time couldn't convincingly show such transformations, but also because they wanted a faster, more action-driven thriller. For audiences living through the early Cold War, the alien invader became a stand-in for the menace of communism, an outside force threatening to infiltrate and consume from within. And this wasn't unique to The Thing. Throughout the 1950s, science fiction would return again and again to this theme, the fear of enemies hiding in plain sight, of invasion, and of survival through vigilance. In many ways, The Thing from Another World set the tone for a decade of paranoia-driven science fiction. The cast included several performers who would go on to become much more recognizable in the years ahead. Margaret Sheridan, discovered by director Howard Hawks, played Nikki, the base secretary who finds herself caught in the chaos. Kenneth Tobey, later known for several 1950s sci-fi roles, portrayed Captain Hendry, the level-headed Air Force officer leading the mission. Robert Cornthwaite, who went on to appear in films like Colossus: The Forbin Project, made Dr. Carrington one of the genre's most memorable, misguided scientists. Douglas Spencer, later seen in This Island Earth, played Scotty, the reporter whose final broadcast warned the world to keep watching the skies. And then there was James Arness, long before his years on Gunsmoke, towering over the rest of the cast as the alien Thing, a role he disliked so much he skipped the premiere, later calling himself a giant carrot. The film's journey from page to screen was filled with creative compromises and practical challenges. The original script featured an alien that looked almost exactly like Campbell's novel described, blue-skinned, with 3 red eyes, a sucker mouth, and stringy hair. Test footage was allegedly shot featuring this more elaborate creature design, played by a one-legged man. However, budget constraints forced the filmmakers to simplify the alien's appearance. Even then, it took makeup artist Lee Greenway 5 months and 18 sculptures of the creature before he came up with a design that satisfied director Howard Hawks. Howard Hawks faced obstacles even before filming began. When he asked the U.S. Air Force for assistance, he was flatly refused. The top brass felt that such cooperation would compromise the government's official stance that UFOs didn't exist. Hawks also had to add "From Another World" to the title to avoid confusion with a popular song called The Thing that was dominating the charts. The production's most closely guarded secret involved James Arness's mysterious alien makeup. But here's the irony. The Thing doesn't appear until 1 hour and 10 minutes into the film, and despite all the secrecy and lengthy application time, Arness himself appears on screen as the Thing for less than 3 minutes total. He's visible at the greenhouse door for under 5 seconds, then again at the climax for about 2 minutes. The dogfight scene, fire sequence, and final electrocution were all handled by stand-ins. In fact, there were more uncredited stuntmen than credited actors. The fire scene proved particularly dangerous. Veteran stuntman Tom Steele replaced Arness, wearing an asbestos suit with a special fiberglass helmet containing a 100% oxygen supply, a setup that was potentially explosive since oxygen accelerates combustion. The filmmakers deliberately removed close-ups of the creature, feeling the makeup couldn't withstand scrutiny. But this decision actually enhanced the Thing's mysterious, threatening presence. To achieve an authentic cold-weather atmosphere, the production faced amusing contradictions. The famous scene where the crew formed a ring around the flying saucer frozen in the ice was actually filmed at the RKO Ranch in the San Fernando Valley in 100-degree weather. For genuine cold effects, they split between Glacier National Park in Montana for exteriors and a Los Angeles ice storage plant for interiors, one of the few ways Hollywood could successfully show actors' breath condensing in the cold. The Thing from Another World went on to be the highest-earning science fiction movie of 1951. It was both a significant commercial success and a film that proved science fiction could be profitable, paving the way for the sci-fi boom of the 1950s. Released September 18, 1951 by 20th Century Fox, The Day the Earth Stood Still quickly became one of the defining science fiction films of the decade. Written by Edmund H. North, a former Army officer who shaped the script in response to the spread of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, the film set itself apart from other alien stories of the era. Set in Washington, D.C., it tells the story of Klaatu, a humanoid visitor from another world, and his towering robot guardian, Gort. Unlike most alien invasion films of its time, this was not about conquest, but a warning. Klaatu's message was simple. If humanity could not set aside its aggression and nuclear ambitions, it would face destruction for the safety of the galaxy. The screenplay was loosely inspired by the short story Farewell to the Master, where the robot, named Gnut, was the true master, and Klaatu only a disposable double. By reversing those roles, The film emphasized the human side of the message, giving audiences a plea for peace that resonated strongly in the early 1950s. Today, it remains one of the most influential sci-fi movies ever made. At the center of the story is British actor Michael Rennie as Klaatu, the calm and commanding visitor from the stars. Rennie wasn't the studio's first choice. The role had originally been offered to Claude Rains, who wanted to accept but was tied to a Broadway commitment. Studio head Daryl F. Zanuck even showed the script to Spencer Tracy, who was eager to play Klaatu. But it was decided that such a famous face would make the alien too familiar. Rennie, by contrast, was largely unknown to American audiences, and that unfamiliarity made him more believable as an otherworldly visitor. His tall frame and quiet dignity made him unforgettable in the role. And he later became familiar to audiences through television, with appearances on The Third Man, Lost in Space, and a recurring role on the Batman TV series as the villainous Sandman. Opposite him is Patricia Neal as Helen, the ordinary woman who becomes Klaatu's ally. At the time, Neal didn't realize she was part of what would become a landmark of science fiction. She later admitted that she assumed it was just another cheap flying saucer picture, and even had trouble keeping a straight face when delivering her lines, especially the now legendary phrase, Klaatu Barada Nikto. Of course, the film went on to become a classic, while Neal herself enjoyed a celebrated career, winning an Academy Award for HUD in 1963 and facing personal tragedy after suffering a series of strokes in 1965. The film also featured Billy Gray as Helen's son Bobby, a role that gave him early recognition before he became a household name as Bud Anderson on the long-running sitcom Father Knows Best. And while the giant robot Gort never spoke a line, the role almost went in a very different direction. During early pre-production, studio chief Daryl F. Zanuck even suggested Jack Palance for the part, but the idea was quickly dropped in favor of someone who could truly tower over the cast. The role ultimately went to Locke Martin, an over 7-foot-tall, non-actor who had once worked as an usher at Grauman's Chinese Theater. His sheer size and presence helped make Gort one of the most memorable robots in movie history. The production of The Day the Earth Stood Still came with plenty of challenges, especially when it came to Gort. The heavy foam suit was too much for Locke Martin to manage, and he couldn't actually carry Patricia Neal or Michael Rennie. To solve the problem, the crew used lightweight dummies, hidden wires, and even a dolly that Rennie sat on, giving the illusion that Gort was lifting him. To hide seams in the costume, 3 different versions of the suit were made, each laced from a different side depending on the camera angle. For stationary shots, the crew relied on a fiberglass statue or a giant bust of Gort's head, with a remote-controlled visor to fire the death ray. The U.S. Army refused to cooperate with the production after reading the script, but the National Guard gladly stepped in, providing troops and equipment for the Washington, D.C. sequences. Ironically, none of the main cast ever filmed in Washington at all. Scenes of Klaatu and young Bobby at the monuments were shot on a soundstage, with background footage supplied by a second unit crew. Music also played a vital role in the film's impact. Composer Bernard Herrmann created one of the most haunting scores in science fiction, layering 2 theremins with pianos, harps, electric organs, percussion, amplified strings, and a massive brass section. The eerie sound cemented the theremin as the signature instrument of 1950s sci-fi. When it opened in 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still was a respectable box office success, earning back its budget and turning a profit while standing apart from typical flying saucer films. Critics praised its intelligence and serious message, and in 1952, it won a Golden Globe for Best Film promoting international understanding. Decades later, the Library of Congress added it to the National Film Registry, cementing its place as one of the most influential science fiction films ever made. By 1953, the alien invasion craze was in full swing, and one of the decade's most unsettling entries came from a child's point of view. Invaders from Mars begins with young David McLean waking to see a glowing saucer land behind his house, only to watch his parents, neighbors, and even the police fall under its sinister control. Strange marks on the back of their necks reveal the truth. Martians have burrowed beneath the sandpit, replacing loved ones with cold, obedient shells. As David struggles to convince the adults around him, the story builds into a nightmare of paranoia and mind control. Shot with bold color and surreal set design, the film blurred the line between science fiction and dream logic, ending with a chilling twist that left audiences wondering whether the nightmare had truly ended. At the center of the story is Jimmy Hunt as young David McClane, whose wide-eyed fear and determination gave the film its emotional core. Hunt had already been a familiar child actor in the late 1940s, but Invaders from Mars became his signature role, so much so that he returned decades later for a cameo in the 1986 remake. David's father is played by Leif Erikson, a seasoned character actor who later found lasting fame on television as Big John Cannon in The High Chaparral. His mother was portrayed by Hilary Brooke, well known to audiences for her roles alongside Abbott and Costello and in comedies with Bob Hope, who here played against type as the seemingly warm, then chillingly altered parent. Rounding out the key cast was Helena Carter as Dr. Pat Blake, the sympathetic scientist who believes David's story, and Arthur Franz as astronomer Dr. Stuart Kelston. Franz also provided the film's opening narration, grounding the story in a scientific frame before the nightmare begins. Already a familiar face to 1950s audiences, he would go on to appear in films like The Caine Mutiny and Monster on the Campus. Together, they gave adult credibility to what could have been dismissed as a child's fantasy, grounding the film's dreamlike atmosphere in a sense of genuine danger. The origins of Invaders from Mars were as unusual as its story. Writer John Tucker Battle was inspired when his wife awoke from a vivid nightmare about Martians taking over Earth. He had her describe everything she could remember, then built the screenplay around her dream. Director William Cameron Menzies was better known as one of Hollywood's great production designers, having shaped the look of classics like Gone with the Wind. Invaders from Mars gave him the chance to direct, and he envisioned the movie as one of the earliest 3D features. His production designs emphasized exaggerated perspective and depth, but when filming began, no 3D cameras were available. Shot instead in standard 2D, the visuals were so striking that many audiences swore they had seen the film in 3D anyway. Working on a tight budget, Menzies relied on ingenuity. To save time and money, Cricket, the family dog, was cut from the script, since filming with animals often slowed production. Special effects were created with clever, inexpensive tricks. The eerie sandpit that swallowed people whole was just canvas, a funnel, and a vacuum, filmed in reverse to show it opening and closing. The bubbles on the underground tunnel walls, made from inflated condoms. The towering Martian mutants required some creative solutions. The Martian mutants were meant to be towering figures, with primary costumes built at 7 feet 7 inches and 8 feet 2 inches. But those suits were too bulky for action scenes. To keep the scale convincing, the filmmakers used shorter actors as stand-ins for the human characters, and smaller stunt performers in alternate mutant suits. On screen, the size contrast still sold the illusion of giant aliens. Adding to the film's atmosphere was its haunting choir of voices, a group of 8 men and 8 women, their sound layered with echo to make it more otherworldly. And the Martian intelligence, encased in glass, was played by Luce Potter, one of the original Munchkins from The Wizard of Oz. She later said fans often wrote to tell her just how much she frightened them as children. Sharp-eyed viewers can also spot a surprising number of familiar faces in small roles. Todd Carnes, Harry Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life, Barbara Billingsley, years before Leave It to Beaver, Milburn Stone, long before Gunsmoke, Robert Shane from Adventures of Superman, Douglas Kennedy, later a Western TV star, and even Locke Martin, the same actor who played Gort in The Day the Earth Stood Still, hidden inside a Martian mutant suit. Though modestly made, Invaders from Mars left an outsized mark on future filmmakers. Steven Spielberg recalled seeing it 5 times as a child, saying it turned his world around. Directors Joe Dante and John Landis also cited it as a key influence, and Martin Scorsese even named it among the 10 greatest films in its use of light and color. For a movie born from a dream, its impact on cinema was anything but fleeting. Released in the summer of 1953 by Universal Pictures, It Came from Outer Space brought something fresh to the growing wave of alien invasion films. Shot in 3D during the early years of America's UFO fascination, and drawn from a story treatment by science fiction master Ray Bradbury, it stood apart from the usual space monster thrills. Set against the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, the story begins when an enormous fireball streaks across the sky and crashes to Earth. At first thought to be a meteor, it's soon revealed as an alien spacecraft. its crew hidden beneath the sands. But instead of mounting an invasion, the extraterrestrials only want to repair their ship and leave. To do so, they impersonate townsfolk, creating suspicion, fear, and paranoia among the locals. Unlike most of its contemporaries, It Came from Outer Space suggested that the aliens weren't villains at all, just strangers, stranded in a hostile world. It was a bold twist for its time, and one that made audiences question whether the real danger came from the visitors above or from our own mistrust here on Earth. Leading the film is Richard Carlson as John Putnam, the small-town astronomer whose warning about the crash is met with skepticism. Carlson was becoming a familiar face in the 1950s science fiction. Soon after this, he starred in The Magnetic Monster and Creature from the Black Lagoon, cementing his reputation as one of the genre's go-to leading men. Opposite him is Barbara Rush as Ellen Fields, the schoolteacher who not only believes John, but finds herself drawn into the aliens' strange duplications. Rush's performance was so strong that she won the Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer, and she went on to enjoy a long career in film and television, appearing in projects ranging from Magnificent Obsession to Peyton Place. Rounding out the cast is Charles Drake as Sheriff Matt Warren, the lawman whose suspicion of John mirrors the town's fear of the unknown. And in a smaller but memorable role, Russell Johnson appears as a telephone lineman, more than a decade before he became best known as the Professor on Gilligan's Island. Behind the camera, Universal poured effort into making It Came from Outer Space stand out from the growing pack of flying saucer films. The studio's makeup department actually submitted 2 competing alien designs. The one that executives rejected wasn't wasted. It resurfaced 2 years later as the famous Metaluna mutant in This Island Earth. Casting choices also reflected Universal's ambitions. Kathleen Hughes appeared in just a brief scene, with only a couple of lines, yet she was prominently featured in the closing montage of players. The studio was grooming her as their answer to Marilyn Monroe, hoping she might become their next breakout star. The movie also carried a technical milestone. It was the very first 3D feature released by Universal. Director Jack Arnold leaned into the format, especially with the alien point-of-view shots. To create the eerie bubble distortion of the creature's vision, technicians actually blew a specially toughened soap bubble directly over the camera lens. The effect looked otherworldly on screen, though each bubble survived only a few seconds before bursting. When It Came from Outer Space arrived in theaters, audiences were intrigued by its 3D visuals and its unusual message of tolerance toward aliens. Critics noted its slower, more thoughtful pace compared to the monster-driven sci-fi of the day. Over time, the film's reputation only grew. Ray Bradbury's influence gave it a literary edge, and Jack Arnold's direction marked the start of a string of classic science fiction pictures that included Creature from the Black Lagoon and Tarantula. By 1953, audiences had seen aliens arrive with warnings, with weapons, and even with sympathy, but none of them looked quite like the invader in Robot Monster. Shot in just 4 days on a shoestring budget of around $16,000. This was an early 3D release that asked moviegoers to take seriously a creature who looked suspiciously like a man in a gorilla suit wearing a space helmet. The story follows Earth's last surviving family, after most of humanity is wiped out by the alien Roman, who patrols the barren landscape, issuing threats through a bubble machine. Though it was intended as a terrifying vision of annihilation, the low-budget effects and oddball production choices made Robot Monster something else entirely. A cult curiosity, often cited as one of the most unintentionally entertaining science fiction films of the decade, that was panned by film critics. Leading the small cast is George Nader as Roy, the stalwart scientist trying to protect the last survivors of humanity. Nader was just beginning to establish himself in Hollywood, later appearing in films like Six Bridges to Cross and The Unguarded Moment, before building a steady career in both American and European productions. Claudia Barrett plays Alice, the film's heroine, who finds herself both resisting and strangely pursued by the alien invader Roman. Selena Royal portrays her mother, while Gregory Moffat appears as Johnny, the boy whose imagination frames the film's events. John Mylong rounds out the cast as the Professor. And then, of course, there's Roman himself. Actor George Barrows supplied the body, wearing his own gorilla suit with a space helmet on top, while the booming threats came from radio actor John Brown. The combination produced one of the most infamous movie monsters of the era. Absurd in design, but unforgettable in cult film history. The budget was so low that no attempt was made to explain how the alien Roman or his elaborate equipment even arrived on Earth. Director Phil Tucker shot the entire film in Bronson Canyon, a rocky patch of Los Angeles that became a favorite location for low-budget science fiction. With no money for sets or convincing effects, the production leaned on open landscapes, stock dinosaur footage, and even a bubble machine to suggest Roman's alien technology. Reportedly, Tucker became depressed after the film's release and attempted to take his own life, but was saved only because he had mailed a letter to a newspaper of his intent to end his life, which dispatched a reporter and detectives to his hotel room. Tucker wrote that he had never been paid for Robot Monster and couldn't find work, although some speculated that it may also have been a publicity stunt. For all its flaws, or maybe because of them, Robot Monster was a hit at the box office. It grossed over $1 million during its initial release, more than 60 times its original investment. Audiences may have laughed as much as they gasped, but they turned out in droves. Decades later, the film lives on as one of the great so bad it's good cult classics. In 1953, the alien invasion finally hit with full force. The War of the Worlds, produced by George Pal and released by Paramount Pictures, took H.G. Wells's classic 1898 novel and unleashed it on Cold War America. Gone were the foggy streets of Victorian England. This time, the Martians landed in small-town California, their sleek, manta ray-like war machines gliding through the sky, vaporizing everything in their path. This was science fiction on an epic scale. Bold Technicolor visuals, thunderous sound design, and groundbreaking special effects that brought Wells's vision of interplanetary annihilation to terrifying life. It wasn't just another alien invasion film. It was a spectacle of destruction and awe that redefined what audiences thought science fiction could be. Gene Barry played Dr. Clayton Forrester, a confident, level-headed scientist who becomes humanity's voice of reason amid global panic. Barry, who would later find television fame in Bat Masterson and Burke's Law, plays Forrester with a mix of confidence and humility, a man of science forced to confront the limits of human understanding. Opposite him is Anne Robinson as Sylvia Van Buren, a college instructor whose faith and vulnerability contrast Forrester's scientific detachment. Though she had appeared in only a few films before this, The War of the Worlds made Robinson a familiar face to 1950s audiences. Her chemistry with Barry gave the chaos a human heartbeat, especially in the film's quieter, desperate moments of survival. And portraying General Mann is Les Tremayne, one of the most recognizable voices of the 1940s radio drama. Though not part of Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds broadcast, Tremayne's rich voice and authoritative presence gave the film a touch of that same radio-era gravitas, a subtle link between H.G. Wells's classic story and its modern cinematic retelling. Behind the camera, The War of the Worlds came together through a remarkable partnership between producer George Pal and legendary filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille. When Alfred Hitchcock declined to direct the project, DeMille selected Pal, already known for Destination Moon and When Worlds Collide, to take charge of production. Though DeMille stayed on as executive producer, he gave Pal full creative freedom. Pal chose Byron Haskin, a veteran effects technician turned director, to bring H.G. Wells's Martian invasion to life. The visual effects, supervised by Gordon Jennings, consumed roughly 70% of the film's $2 million budget. Pal initially planned to depict the Martians and their machines as described in Wells's 1898 novel, tripods striding across the landscape. But a U.S. Army technical advisor advised that such designs wouldn't pose a serious threat to modern weaponry. Pal reimagined them as sleek, hovering war machines equipped with force fields and heat rays. Production designer Albert Nizaki modeled their shape and movement after manta rays, cobras, and swans, creating one of science fiction's most recognizable designs. Each machine was controlled by nearly 20 wires that carried power to its lights and movements, an intricate system built long before modern remote control circuitry. The eerie sounds of the Martian war machines were some of the most inventive of the decade. To create the menacing shriek of the death ray, the effects team mounted a wooden disc to a power drill slightly off-center, spun it at high speed, and pressed it against the string of an electric guitar. The strange grinding tone that resulted, like a metallic scream, became one of the most distinctive sound effects in science fiction. To give the Martian war machines their unearthly hum, the sound crew used an early tape echo device called an echoplex. This helped produce that distinctive low vibration of the hovering ships, and later inspired the phaser sound effect on Star Trek. Another innovation came from the creation of the skeleton ray, the weapon that reduced its victims to ash. For that, engineers struck the side of a massive empty oil tank and erased the initial impact, keeping only the deep resonant echo that followed. That same method would later be used to craft the sound of the photon torpedo in Star Trek. The sound of the ship shutting down was achieved by recording vacuum cleaners being turned off. Makeup artist Charles Gamora, who also played the Martian, designed the creature suit from foam latex, coated in glycerin and stage blood to give it a wet, organic look. Because the costume was only 4 feet tall, Gamora, who was 5'3", had to kneel inside it while crew members maneuvered him on a dolly. A set assistant beneath the floor pumped air into the veins to make them pulse. Despite its fragility, the Martian's brief appearance remains one of the film's most memorable moments. Filming presented challenges for the cast as well. Gene Barry admitted it was difficult to perform against empty space, reacting to effects that would only be added later. In one key sequence, Uncle Matthew's ill-fated attempt to communicate with the Martians, Anne Robinson screamed into empty air, having been told only to react as if you've just seen the worst thing imaginable. As an homage to the story's famous radio legacy, voice actor Paul Frees appeared on screen as a reporter, performing an Orson Welles-style narration, recalling the panic of the 1938 broadcast. For George Pal, the success of The War of the Worlds proved career-defining. The H.G. Wells estate was so pleased with the finished film that it granted him his choice of Wells's other works to adapt next. Pal chose The Time Machine, continuing his legacy as one of cinema's great visionaries of science fiction. Upon its release in August 1953, The War of the Worlds was both a commercial and critical triumph. Audiences were captivated by its mixture of spectacle and terror, a vision of global destruction unlike anything they'd seen before. Reviewers praised its technical brilliance, even as some critics noted its darker undercurrents of Cold War fear and religious symbolism. The film went on to win the Academy Award for Best Special Effects, honoring the extraordinary work of Gordon Jennings and his Paramount team. The miniature craftsmanship, color cinematography, and sound design set new benchmarks for the genre, influencing everything from Forbidden Planet to Independence Day decades later. In later years, both Gene Barry and Anne Robinson made cameo appearances as the grandparents in Steven Spielberg's 2005 remake, closing the circle on a story that had shaped generations of moviegoers. By 1954, the alien invasion craze had crossed the Atlantic, but in Britain, it took on a darker, more intimate tone. While American audiences watched cities crumble under Martian heat rays, UK filmmakers imagined terror arriving not in a blaze of destruction, but quietly, through the misty Scottish Highlands. That's where Devil Girl from Mars begins. A strange visitor from the Red Planet crash lands near an isolated inn, where a handful of unsuspecting people soon find themselves face to face with a cold, beautiful emissary of conquest. Her name is Naya, a black-clad, imperious alien sent to Earth to recruit, or rather abduct, men to replace the dying males of Mars. Released in April of 1954, this British production turned familiar sci-fi tropes on their head. Instead of bug-eyed monsters or roaring machines, it offered a tale of seduction, power, and gender inversion, told with low-budget ingenuity and an eerie sense of quiet dread. At the center of this strange, stylish little film is Patricia Laffin as Naya, the Devil Girl herself. A sleek, emotionless emissary from Mars, wrapped head to toe in black vinyl, and commanding a powerful robot with icy precision. Laffin, a classically trained British actress best known at the time for her role as the scheming Empress Poppaea in Quo Vadis, brought an otherworldly authority to the part. Opposite her was Hugh McDermott, playing reporter Michael Carter, the skeptical outsider caught in the middle of the nightmare. The film also featured Hazel Court, who would later become a British horror icon through her work with Hammer Films in The Curse of Frankenstein and Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death. Here she plays Ellen Prestwick, a visiting model whose quiet getaway turns chaotic when an alien ship lands nearby. Rounding out the cast were John Laurie, known to modern audiences for Dad's Army, and Adrian Corey, who would go on to appear in A Clockwork Orange. The film was based on a failed BBC television play of the same name, written by John C. Mayer and adapted for the screen by James Eastwood. When the live broadcast was plagued by technical issues, producers decided to turn the idea into a feature film, partly to recoup costs, and partly to take advantage of the growing public fascination with outer space. Director David MacDonald and producer Edward J. Danziger faced tight constraints from the start. The budget was small, the schedule was short with filming only taking about 3 weeks, and most of the interior sets were left over from another Danziger production. Rather than trying to hide those limitations, they leaned into them. The entire story was confined to a single, fog-shrouded inn and the surrounding moors, giving the movie a theatrical, almost claustrophobic atmosphere that worked surprisingly well. The film's most unforgettable element was Patricia Laffon's portrayal of Naya. Dressed in a skin-tight black PVC costume and sculpted headpiece, she looked every bit the futuristic femme fatale. But the costume came at a price. Laffin reportedly wasn't allowed to eat or drink during filming because getting in and out of it was so difficult. Her composed, icy performance turned that discomfort into a chilling kind of authority, making Naya one of the decade's most striking alien figures. Even the film's limited special effects added to its charm. The towering robot Chani might have moved awkwardly, but its stiff, mechanical gait became oddly memorable. When Devil Girl from Mars premiered in 1954, critics weren't sure what to make of it. British reviewers dismissed it as stagey and absurd, while American audiences, who first encountered it a year later on double bills with Them and It Came from Outer Space, saw it as exotic and oddly sophisticated. Its dialogue was stiff, its pacing deliberate, but there was something undeniably captivating about Patricia Laffon's performance. She brought an elegance and menace that lingered long after the credits rolled. Over time, what began as a modest, low-budget curiosity grew into a full-fledged cult favorite. Sci-fi fans embraced its mix of pulp melodrama and sly subtext. And later generations saw Naya as an early example of the powerful female alien archetype, a figure echoed in everything from Barbarella to Species. But the invasion wasn't over. In the years that followed, the creatures grew bolder, the effects stranger, and the fears even closer to home. Join us in Part 2 as we continue our journey through the alien invasion films of the 1950s, when Earth was under siege and imagination knew no limits.